Now, in this video, I'm going to make a very interesting prediction, which might come as a surprise to many of you, especially if you've been watching my previous videos. Now, I'm also going to try and explain what this pattern that's forming here on Bitcoin could potentially mean. But before I do that, let me just quickly say this. Firstly, as you probably know, as I've been saying this now for some time, the fact that Bitcoin keeps coming down, the fact that Bitcoin has failed every single time for these rallies to succeed. You see these rallies here? These rallies all have failed. Okay, so what I've been saying now is that these failed rallies, the fact that Bitcoin keeps coming down, testing this key level at 6,000. So this is the key level I'm talking about here. So the fact that Bitcoin keeps coming down and testing these levels at 6,000 or 5,900 is a bearish signal for Bitcoin. And I think potentially by the beginning of next year, I think more likely in the beginning of 2019, we're going to see Bitcoin taking out and breaking this floor. Okay, so I think it's likely that by perhaps the start of 2019, I don't think it's going to happen this year. I think it's more likely to happen in the first half of 2019 that we could potentially break below 6,000 and potentially even below 5,000 as well. That's for, I think, next year. But between now and December, here's what I think is going to happen. And that's because of the pattern that's forming here on Bitcoin. So actually, you might be surprised to hear that I'm actually bullish between now and December. So here's why. Take a look at this pattern. This is a very interesting pattern that's forming here, and I'm sure many of you have noticed it too. This is a sort of a triangular formation pattern. If you just connect these highs, and if we just connect these lows, so you can see this triangular formation, and Bitcoin is just coiling. As you can see, Bitcoin has been coiling inside this pattern. And as you can see, the coiling is actually getting tighter and tighter. It's like a spring that's being coiled, and of course, eventually the tension that's building inside this coiling is going to break. Just like a spring, for example, okay, just like a coil or a spring that gets tightened, and eventually when that tension gets released, we see movement. So that's what I think is happening here on Bitcoin, this coiling effect that's happening here, as you can see here, if I just expand and zoom in on the screen. Now, you might be asking, well, what does all this mean? Well, it means that this pattern, to my mind, when I see a pattern like this tight triangular formation like this, okay, let me just draw this one more time. When you see this tightening coiling effect in this triangular formation, this pattern is much more likely to break to the upside. I think it's far more likely that Bitcoin is screaming, Bitcoin is aching to break this pattern to the upside. Now, you might be thinking, well, why to the upside than to the downside? Let me explain this. There's about 2 or 3 reasons for this. Actually, there's a lot of reasons for this, but let me just mention a couple here in this video. The first one is this, something I mentioned now in my previous videos quite a lot, which is Bitcoin seasonality. Bitcoin seasonality, in case you've missed my previous videos, is the fact that in certain periods of the year, Bitcoin is quite bullish, it's quite strong, and in certain periods of the year, it's quite weak. So we know, for example, historically and seasonally, between June and October, Bitcoin is quite weak. We've seen that happening this year too. But between the period of October to December, it just so happens that Bitcoin acts rather strong. Okay, as you saw yourself last year in 2017, Bitcoin staged a very powerful rally between the October to December period. Very powerful rally. And we've seen this pattern repeating itself across many years in the past. So again, just to repeat this point, between October to December, Bitcoin has a strong bullish bias. That's important to remember. The other factor to consider is sentiment. The fact that people have lost interest in Bitcoin over the last few months. In fact, from the beginning of the year. Just take a look at this. This is the Google Trends chart. And you can see from January of this year to now, here in October now, we're almost entering October now, we can see this kind of general trend that really the general public have lost interest in Bitcoin. There's been a flatlining of interest. And by the way, in case you're wondering, that's a good thing for Bitcoin. As a contrarian, you want that to happen, okay? So the fact that people, the general public, the average Joe in the street, has lost interest in Bitcoin, and in fact, we've seen sentiment dropping from bullish to bearish, that is a contrarian and positive signal for Bitcoin, okay? So that's 2 things now that bode well for Bitcoin. And I would say the third factor is that I just think this pattern that we're looking at here on Bitcoin, this triangular formation, again, as I mentioned before, this pattern is just screaming for the algorithms to break it. And I think that's what's likely to happen between now in the next few weeks. And I think by the middle of October, maybe by the middle to the end of October, what's likely to happen is the algorithms designed by institutions, I think these high-frequency trading algorithms, are going to potentially break this triangular formation to the upside. Okay, I mean, just the fact that Bitcoin keeps coming and testing this pattern, keeps coming testing this trend line here, to me, this is just a pure example of how algorithms are going to eventually break this pattern to the upside, and we might see a potential rally. I think we could see a 10 to 20% rally in Bitcoin when that eventually happens. Now, that rally might fail, absolutely, but given the seasonal strength in Bitcoin that I just mentioned a few moments ago, given the seasonal strength, and given the sentiment dropping, sentiment turning against Bitcoin, I think the far more likely period, the far more likely scenario is if we break this pattern to the upside, which I think is quite likely, we might see a short-term rally, about a 10 to 20% rally between the October to December period. By the way, let me just mention this, that there is still a risk that Bitcoin could break this floor to the downside. It might break to the downside of the triangle instead of the upside. So there is a risk of that happening. But all I'm saying is, given the patterns, given the seasonality, given the sentiment, there's about a 55 to 60% probability that we might see a breakout to the upside than the downside. That's all I'm saying. And in case you're wondering, is a 55 to 60% probability any good? Yes, it is. Because remember, some of the best traders in the world, like Paul Tudor Jones and Linda Raschke, they've often traded, and they do often trade, with about a 55 to 60% probability. All right, guys, just to let you know that I've covered Bitcoin in much more detail. All right, guys, if this video has helped, please give it a thumbs up, and also please subscribe for more videos as well. Thanks very much indeed.